Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, has become the single most powerful symbol of the water crisis gripping the American West. Held back by one of the most famous dams ever built, this vast store of water on the great river of the Southwest supplies the lifeblood of an entire region, and for decades it stood full and mighty. A monument to human mastery over a dry and demanding land. But Lake Mead is in trouble, and it is getting worse. Its waters have fallen dramatically, retreating far from their old high marks and leaving pale rings of mineral on the surrounding rock, a stark and unmistakable measure of how much has been lost. As the reservoir continues to decline, drawn down by a relentless drought, a warming climate, and a demand that has always been too great, the millions of people who depend on it face a deepening danger, and there are cities across the region that stand more at risk than any others. This is the story of Lake Mead's worsening crisis, and of the 10 cities that are most at risk as its waters fall. Before we go further, one honest word about what this really means. To say that Lake Mead is getting worse and that these cities are most at risk does not mean their taps are about to run dry, or that disaster is imminent tomorrow. It means the great reservoir on which they depend is declining, that the water security they long enjoyed can no longer be taken for granted, and that they face real and growing challenges as the reservoir falls toward the critical levels that everyone fears. Understanding what is happening to Lake Mead and which cities are most exposed to its decline is the key to understanding one of the most important challenges facing the American West, and that understanding is what this video is here to provide. Real quick, before we go further, a lot of people watch these all the way to the end, genuinely enjoy them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a small channel like ours alive: hitting subscribe. It is honestly important right now. Our sub rate is low, and every single tap makes a real difference. So if you are finding this valuable, please subscribe right now. It takes 1 second and costs you nothing. And drop the name of your city in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. Why Lake Mead is getting worse to understand why the cities are at risk. We must first understand why Lake Mead is getting worse. For its decline is the result of a fundamental imbalance that has been deepening for years. Lake Mead is a reservoir, a great artificial lake formed when the dam was built and the waters of the river backed up behind it, and like any reservoir, its level depends on the balance between the water flowing in and the water flowing out. Water flows into Lake Mead from the river above, which is fed by the melting snows of the distant mountains, and water flows out to supply the cities and farms below, and to evaporate from the reservoir's broad surface under the desert sun. When more water flows out than flows in, year after year, the reservoir falls. For years now, that balance has tipped sharply against Lake Mead. The river that feeds it has been diminished by a severe and persistent drought, one of the worst the region has seen in centuries, so that far less water arrives than the reservoir needs to stay full. The warming climate has intensified the drought and worked against the reservoir in several ways at once, shrinking the mountain snowpack that feeds the river, causing that snow to melt earlier and faster, drying the soil so that less water reaches the river, and evaporating more water directly from the reservoir's surface as the temperatures rise. Meanwhile, the demand for the water has remained high, drawn off to supply the great cities and the vast farms of the region, so that more water is taken from the system than the river now provides. The result is a steady and worsening decline, as Lake Mead is drawn down faster than it can be refilled, its level dropping year after year toward the critical thresholds below which its ability to function would be crippled. And because the forces behind the decline, the warming climate and the enduring demand, are strengthening rather than fading, the crisis is not easing, but getting worse. It is worth understanding what the worsening of Lake Mead's crisis would look like as the reservoir continues to fall, for the decline does not arrive all at once, but crosses a series of ever more dangerous thresholds. As the water drops, the first great threshold is the level below which the dam can no longer generate electricity. For the power depends on the water being high enough to flow through the turbines with sufficient force, and once the water falls below that point, the generation that supplies power to a wide region would cease, removing a major source of electricity from the grid. Below that lies a still more dangerous threshold, the level at which it becomes difficult for water to pass through the dam and continue downstream, so that the delivery of water to the cities and farms below would be threatened. And at the very bottom lies the level known as dead pool, at which the water is too low to pass through the dam at all, so that the reservoir could no longer send water downstream, and the river below the dam would be starved of the flow on which everything depends. Each of these thresholds represents a deepening of the crisis, and Lake Mead has been falling toward them, its level dropping in recent years to points that were once thought impossible and that have brought the reservoir closer to these dangerous zones than ever before. This is the trajectory that makes the decline of Lake Mead so alarming. For it is not merely falling, but falling toward thresholds beyond which the consequences for the region would be severe. The first city, Las Vegas. On the reservoir's doorstep, we begin with Las Vegas, the city that sits closest of all to Lake Mead and depends on it most completely, for the great desert metropolis draws the overwhelming majority of its water directly from the reservoir, so that its fortunes are bound more tightly to Lake Mead than those of any other major city. Las Vegas rose improbably in one of the driest places in the country, and it leans almost entirely on the one reservoir on its doorstep, so that the worsening of Lake Mead's crisis strikes directly at the heart of the city's water supply. Las Vegas has done more than almost any other city to prepare for this danger, becoming a world leader in water conservation, tearing out thirsty grass, banning it in new developments, and recycling nearly all the water used indoors, so that it has managed to reduce its total water use even as its population has grown substantially. Above all, recognizing that Lake Mead could fall to dangerously low levels, the city built a new intake deep in the reservoir, a costly and difficult engineering feat, so that it could keep drawing water even if the level dropped near the very bottom, below the older intakes that would be left high and dry. This deep intake is a kind of insurance against the worst, ensuring that Las Vegas could continue to draw water from Lake Mead even in a severe decline. But no amount of preparation can change the fundamental fact that the city draws nearly all its water from a single reservoir that is getting worse, and if Lake Mead were to fall so low that it could no longer reliably deliver water, even this remarkably efficient and well-prepared city would face a crisis of the first order. The story of the deep intake that Las Vegas built is worth telling more fully, for it captures both the seriousness of the threat and the lengths to which the city has gone to meet it. As Lake Mead fell, the older intakes through which the city drew its water came into danger of being left above the surface of the shrinking reservoir, which would have cut off the city's supply. Rather than wait for that to happen, the city undertook an enormous and difficult engineering project, boring a new intake deep beneath the reservoir, near the very bottom, so that it could continue to draw water even if Lake Mead fell to levels near dead pool. This project, sometimes described as a straw reaching to the bottom of the glass, was a costly and technically demanding feat, but it ensured that Las Vegas could keep drawing water from the reservoir even in a severe decline, and it stands as a testament to the city's determination to secure its water. Yet even this remarkable insurance has its limits, for if the reservoir fell so low that it could no longer deliver water at all, the deep intake would draw from an all but empty basin, and no engineering could conjure water that was not there. Las Vegas, on the reservoir's doorstep and dependent on it almost completely, is among the cities most at risk as Lake Mead declines. The second city, Henderson, sharing the same lifeline our second city, is Henderson, the large city that lies just beside Las Vegas in the same desert valley, sharing the same fundamental dependence on Lake Mead for its water. As one of the largest cities in Nevada and part of the great metropolitan area that has grown up in the valley, Henderson draws its water from the same source as its famous neighbor, from the great reservoir that supplies the whole region, so that it faces the same risk as Lake Mead declines. Henderson has grown rapidly along with the rest of the valley, its population swelling as people have been drawn to the region, and this growth has added to the demand on a water supply that is under mounting pressure. Like Las Vegas, Henderson benefits from the aggressive conservation and the careful management that have made the valley a leader in stretching its water. And it shares in the protection offered by the deep intake and the recycling of the water used indoors. But it also shares in the fundamental vulnerability, for the entire valley, Henderson included, depends overwhelmingly on Lake Mead, and the worsening of the reservoir's crisis threatens the whole community. The situation of Henderson illustrates an important point about the crisis, that entire metropolitan areas, not just individual cities, can rise or fall together on the fate of a single reservoir. The Great Valley in which Las Vegas and Henderson lie is home to millions of people spread across several cities and communities, and nearly all of them depend on Lake Mead, so that the decline of the reservoir is not a threat to one city alone, but to a whole region and its interconnected economy. This concentration of dependence is both a vulnerability and, in a sense, a spur to unified action. For the shared reliance on Lake Mead gives all the communities of the valley a common interest in protecting the reservoir and in conserving the water, and it has helped drive the aggressive conservation that has made the valley a leader in stretching its supply. Henderson has been part of this collective effort, adopting the same water-saving measures and benefiting from the same recycling and the same deep intake that protect the whole valley. But the fundamental exposure remains, for no amount of shared effort can change the fact that the entire valley leans on one declining reservoir. Henderson, sharing the same lifeline as Las Vegas and the same near-total dependence on the declining reservoir, stands among the cities most at risk, its fate bound up with that of the great store of water on which the whole valley relies. Quick question I would genuinely love your take on, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you know that a single reservoir supplies almost all the water for the entire Las Vegas area, millions of people, in the middle of the desert? Drop a yes or a no in the comments, because your answers help me understand what surprises people most, and I read every single reply. Okay, back to the cities. The third city, Phoenix. Drawing from Mead through the canal, our third city is Phoenix, the vast metropolis of the Arizona desert, one of the largest and fastest growing cities in the nation, which draws a large share of its water from Lake Mead through an immense canal that carries the water released from the reservoir across the desert to the city. Though Phoenix does not sit on the shore of Lake Mead, it is deeply dependent on the reservoir. For the water it draws through the Great Canal comes from the releases that flow out of Lake Mead and down the river, so that the health of the reservoir directly determines the water the city receives. Phoenix is especially at risk because of its position in the sharing of the river, for the water carried through its canal holds a junior priority, meaning that when Lake Mead falls and the shortage deepens, this water is among the first to be cut. Already, as the reservoir has declined, Phoenix has begun to see reductions in the water it can expect from the canal. And deeper cuts loom as Lake Mead continues to fall. The city has prepared with unusual care, banking water underground in the wetter years and investing heavily in conservation, and it draws on other sources as well, from rivers within the state and from groundwater beneath the valley. But those other sources are themselves under strain. And the vast quantity of water the city draws from the Colorado through the canal cannot easily be replaced. The connection between Lake Mead and Phoenix, though it runs through hundreds of miles of canal, is direct and unbreakable, for the Great Canal that carries water to the city draws from the river below Lake Mead, and the flow in that river depends on the releases from the reservoir. When Lake Mead is high, the releases are generous and the canal runs full. When Lake Mead falls, the releases are reduced and the water available to the canal shrinks. And because Arizona accepted a junior priority for this water in exchange for the funding to build the canal, the state's deliveries are cut before those of some of its neighbors. This is why Phoenix, despite lying far from the reservoir, is among the cities most directly affected by its decline, for the worsening of Lake Mead translates, through the mechanics of the river and the rules of priority, into direct cuts to the water carried to the city. The scale of what is at stake is enormous, for the metropolitan area around Phoenix has grown into one of the largest population centers in the country, home to millions of people who have made their lives in the desert on the strength of this imported water, and the city continues to grow even now, adding new residents and new developments in a place where the summer heat is among the most extreme recorded anywhere. As Lake Mead gets worse and the cuts to the Junior Canal water deepen, Phoenix, a sprawling giant in the desert with an enormous thirst, stands among the cities most at risk, its careful preparation notwithstanding. The fourth city, Tucson. First in line for cuts, our fourth city is Tucson, the desert city of southern Arizona, which draws much of its water from Lake Mead through the same great canal that supplies Phoenix, and which holds an even more junior priority, placing it at the very front of the line for cuts when the reservoir falls. This means that as Lake Mead gets worse, Tucson's canal water is among the first of all to be reduced, its junior standing leaving it acutely exposed to the reservoir's decline. Yet Tucson has been remarkably foresighted about its vulnerable position, and its story offers a measure of hope amid the danger. For many years, rather than using all of its canal water directly, the city has taken much of it and stored it underground, recharging the aquifer beneath the city and banking a substantial reserve against the day when its deliveries are cut. This banked water, combined with the city's strong conservation and its careful management, gives it a cushion that its junior position would not otherwise suggest, a store of water that could help carry it through even a severe reduction in its supply from Lake Mead. As the reservoir gets worse and Tucson's canal water is cut, this banked reserve would be its lifeline, allowing it to endure the loss far better than most cities could. Tucson thus illustrates both the peril of holding a junior claim to a declining reservoir and the wisdom of preparing for the worst in advance, and though it is among the first to lose its water as Lake Mead falls, it has given itself a better chance than most of weathering the crisis. Quick pause, because this part matters, and it deserves to be seen by more people. If you are getting real value from this, tap the like button. It genuinely helps the video reach others who care about where their water comes from. And if you have family or friends anywhere in the Southwest, share this with them, because it honestly matters that the people who depend on this water understand what is happening to it. One like, one share to someone in your family, and let's keep going. The fifth city, Mesa, a growing giant on the same canal our fifth city, is Mesa, one of the largest cities of the Arizona desert, part of the great metropolitan area around Phoenix, which draws a significant share of its water from Lake Mead through the same immense canal that supplies the region. As one of the most populous cities in the state, Mesa has grown into a giant in its own right. Home to a large and expanding population, and its dependence on the canal water released from Lake Mead ties its fate to the reservoir's decline. Like the other cities that draw from the Great Canal, Mesa is exposed to the cuts that fall on the junior water when Lake Mead declines, and as the reservoir gets worse, the water carried to the city could be reduced. Mesa draws on other sources as well, including rivers within the state and groundwater, which give it some measure of flexibility, and it benefits from the careful planning that the region has undertaken to prepare for a drier future. But its large and growing population, its desert setting, and its reliance on the canal water from Lake Mead place it among the cities at risk as the reservoir falls. For a city of its size cannot easily reduce its need for water, and the loss of a significant portion of its supply from the declining reservoir would be a serious blow. The inclusion of Mesa among the cities at risk highlights a truth about the Phoenix metropolitan area, that it is not a single city, but a vast constellation of large cities, each substantial in its own right, all drawing on the same stressed sources, and all exposed to the decline of Lake Mead. Mesa alone is home to a population that would make it a major city anywhere in the country, and it sits alongside several other large cities in the same sprawling metropolitan area, so that the total population dependent on the region's water is enormous. This means that the cuts to the canal water that follow from Lake Mead's decline threaten not one city, but a whole metropolitan region of millions, magnifying the stakes of the reservoir's fall. Mesa has worked to secure its water, developing its own sources and participating in the region's careful planning, but its large population and its desert setting leave it exposed. Mesa, a growing giant on the same canal that feeds Phoenix and Tucson, stands among the cities most at risk as Lake Mead gets worse. The sixth city, Scottsdale, wealth meeting scarcity, our sixth city is Scottsdale. A prosperous city in the Arizona desert, part of the great metropolitan area around Phoenix, known for its golf courses, its resorts, and its affluent communities, which draws a share of its water from Lake Mead through the Great Canal, and which faces the collision between a lifestyle built on abundant water and the reality of a declining reservoir. Scottsdale has grown into a wealthy and desirable place, its landscapes green and its amenities lavish, but this way of life depends on water, much of it drawn from the Colorado through the canal fed by Lake Mead. As the reservoir gets worse and the junior canal water is cut, Scottsdale faces the challenge of sustaining its water-intensive way of life on a shrinking supply. The city has resources and has taken steps to prepare, but the sheer intensity of its water use, in a desert where the resource is growing scarce, places it among the cities at risk. There is a particular lesson in Scottsdale's situation, for it illustrates that wealth alone cannot conjure water where there is none, and that even the most prosperous communities must ultimately reckon with the limits of the desert. As Lake Mead declines, Scottsdale will have to confront difficult choices about how it uses its water. And its situation is a reminder that the worsening of the reservoir's crisis reaches even into the most affluent corners of the region, for the water that sustains the lush landscapes of the desert comes, in significant part, from the same declining reservoir on which the whole region depends. The case of Scottsdale raises a broader question that the whole region must confront as Lake Mead declines, the question of how water should be prioritized when it grows scarce. Should the limited water go first to the essential needs of drinking, cooking, and sanitation, or should it continue to sustain the golf courses, the ornamental lakes, and the green lawns that have become symbols of desert prosperity? As the reservoir falls, these questions grow more pressing, and the luxuries that were once taken for granted come under scrutiny. Scottsdale, with its water-intensive way of life, sits at the center of this tension, and its choices in the years ahead will be watched as a test of whether a prosperous desert community can adapt its habits to the reality of a shrinking supply. There is no reason it cannot, for even lavish water use can be reduced through efficiency and through the reshaping of the landscapes. But it will require a change in expectations and a willingness to accept that the desert cannot indefinitely sustain the appearance of a wetter land. All right, I know, this is the second time I am bringing this up. You can roll your eyes at me. But honestly, if you have made it this deep into a video about Lake Mead, you clearly care about this stuff. And a lot of you watching still have not subscribed. I am not going to make you feel bad about it, but that one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel fighting a low sub rate. It really does matter to us. That is the last time I will ask. Promise. Let's finish. The seventh city, Los Angeles, reaching to Mead from the coast. Our seventh city is Los Angeles, the vast metropolis of Southern California, which draws a significant share of its water from the Colorado through a long aqueduct that carries the river's water, released from Lake Mead and flowing downstream, across the desert to the coast. Though Los Angeles lies far from the reservoir and has other sources as well, from the mountains to the east and from the north of the state, its share of the Colorado is an important part of its supply, and the worsening of Lake Mead's crisis threatens that portion of its water. The water that Los Angeles draws from the Colorado depends on the releases from Lake Mead flowing down the river to the point where the aqueduct draws it off, so that the health of the reservoir matters to the city even at such a great distance. Los Angeles holds a relatively senior priority in the sharing of the river, which offers it some protection, for the most senior users are cut last. But even a senior user could not fully escape a severe worsening of the reservoir's crisis, and the loss of its Colorado water would strain a city whose demands are enormous, and whose other sources are themselves under pressure from drought and the shrinking snowpack. The city has invested heavily in conservation, recycling, and the capture of stormwater. And it is working to reduce its reliance on the distant river, but its dependence on the Colorado, along with the strain on all its other sources, keeps it among the cities at risk as Lake Mead gets worse. A reminder that even a great and resourceful metropolis on the distant coast is bound to the fate of the reservoir in the desert. There is a certain irony in the exposure of Los Angeles, for the city lies beside the vast Pacific Ocean, with more water in view than almost any inland city could imagine, and yet that water is salt and undrinkable without costly treatment, so that the city must reach hundreds of miles inland to the Colorado for a portion of the fresh water it needs. This dependence on distant sources has always been the city's fundamental vulnerability, the price of building a metropolis of millions in a place with little water of its own, and the worsening of Lake Mead's crisis exposes that vulnerability anew, reminding the city that its water comes from places far beyond its control and subject to forces it cannot command. The eighth city, San Diego, The most import-dependent of all our 8th city is San Diego, the great coastal city of Southern California that has depended even more heavily than Los Angeles on imported water, including a large share drawn from the Colorado through the aqueduct fed by the releases from Lake Mead, and that would feel the reservoir's worsening crisis keenly. San Diego sits in a dry region with little local water, and it has long relied on water brought from afar, so that the health of the Colorado and of Lake Mead, which regulates its flow, matters greatly to the city's security. San Diego learned the danger of its dependence during an earlier drought when its imported water was threatened and the city came uncomfortably close to a crisis, an experience that spurred it to invest heavily in securing and diversifying its supply. It turned to the ocean, building the capacity to remove salt from seawater, and it secured more reliable arrangements for the water it imports, so that it is better prepared today than it once was. This foresight would serve it well as Lake Mead declines, giving it more resilience than many other cities, for its ability to draw water from the sea would keep flowing even as the reservoir fell. But the fundamental fact remains that San Diego depends heavily on imported water, and a significant portion comes from the Colorado regulated by Lake Mead, so that the worsening of the reservoir's crisis would force the city to lean even harder on its other sources and its desalination, and would still represent a serious challenge to a city built in a dry land far from any abundant supply of its own. San Diego's earlier brush with crisis is worth recalling, for it offers a lesson that the whole region would do well to heed. During a past drought, when a dispute and a shortage threatened the water the city imported, San Diego found itself dangerously dependent on a single supplier and a single vulnerable source, and the fright of that experience drove it to act with unusual determination. Investing in desalination, securing more reliable arrangements for its imported water, and diversifying its supply so that it would never again be so exposed. The result is that San Diego today is better prepared for the decline of Lake Mead than it once was, a demonstration that a city can transform its vulnerability into resilience if it has the will and the resources to do so. This is a hopeful example amid a worrying picture, for it shows that the cities at risk are not helpless, and that determined preparation can meaningfully reduce the danger. San Diego, the most import-dependent of the great coastal cities, stands among those at risk as Lake Mead gets worse, but it has done more than most to soften the blow. The 9th city, Riverside. In the Inland Empire, our 9th city is Riverside, a large city in the inland region of Southern California, part of the fast-growing area east of the great coastal metropolises, which draws a share of its water from the Colorado through the same great aqueduct system fed by the releases from Lake Mead, and which faces the reservoir's decline along with the rest of the region. Riverside and the surrounding communities have grown rapidly, their population swelling as people have moved inland in search of more affordable homes, and this growth has increased the demand on a water supply that includes an important share from the Colorado. As Lake Mead gets worse and the Colorado water grows scarcer, Riverside and its neighbors face the challenge of sustaining their growing population on a supply under mounting pressure. The region draws on other sources as well, including groundwater and water from the north of the state, but these too are stressed, and the portion that comes from the Colorado, regulated by Lake Mead, is an important part of the mix. The rapid growth of the inland region, occurring even as the water supply tightens, places Riverside among the cities at risk, for a fast-growing area dependent in part on a declining reservoir is on a difficult path. The inland region around Riverside deserves particular attention, for it has been one of the fastest-growing parts of the entire country, drawing families and businesses inland from the crowded and expensive coast in search of more affordable homes and more space. This growth has been a source of prosperity, but it has also placed a rapidly rising demand on a water supply that includes an important share from the Colorado, regulated by Lake Mead, so that the region is adding people at the very moment when one of its key sources is under growing pressure. This is a difficult combination. For a region that continues to grow while its water supply tightens is on a path that cannot continue indefinitely without careful management and difficult choices. The communities of the inland region have worked to secure their water and to conserve, but their rapid expansion, occurring in a warming climate and drawing in part on a declining reservoir, leaves them exposed. Riverside, in the inland region and dependent in part on the Colorado water regulated by Lake Mead, stands among the cities most at risk as the reservoir declines, its growth colliding with the reality of a shrinking supply. The 10th city, Yuma, where the river runs low, our 10th and final city, is Yuma, the desert city, near where the Colorado approaches the end of its journey. In a region of intense heat and almost no rain that has become one of the most productive agricultural areas in the country precisely because of the river's water whose flow is regulated by the releases from Lake Mead upstream. Yuma sits far downstream of the reservoir, drawing its water from the river below, but its supply depends on the water that flows out of Lake Mead and down the river to reach it, so that the health of the reservoir matters to the city even at the far end of the system. The worsening of Lake Mead's crisis threatens Yuma and the vast farmland around it, for the city and its agriculture depend on the river almost completely, and have little to fall back upon in the surrounding desert. The farms of the region, which produce a remarkable share of the nation's winter vegetables, rely entirely on the river's water carried through an intricate system of canals. And as Lake Mead declines and the flow of the river is reduced, that agriculture faces mounting pressure. Yuma and its farms hold senior rights that offer them real protection, a legacy of having put the water to use very early. But even senior rights cannot deliver water that the river no longer carries, and a severe worsening of the reservoir's crisis would test the value of any claim. There is a special significance to Yuma's place in this story, for the agriculture around the city is not a minor matter, but a pillar of the nation's food supply, growing a remarkable share of the fresh vegetables that fill the country's markets during the winter months, when little else can be grown anywhere in the nation. The lettuce, the leafy greens, and the other crops that come from the fields around Yuma travel to tables thousands of miles away, so that the worsening of Lake Mead's crisis, by threatening the water that sustains this agriculture, reaches far beyond the region and into the food supply of the whole country. This is a dimension of the crisis that is easy to overlook, for the connection between a falling reservoir in the desert and the vegetables on a distant dinner table is not obvious, and yet it is real and direct, a reminder that the decline of Lake Mead is a national concern and not merely a regional one. Yuma, sitting where the river runs low near its end and depending on it almost completely, stands among the cities most at risk as Lake Mead gets worse. A place where the reservoir's decline would strike at the very foundation of life and livelihood, and where the effects would ripple outward to touch the whole nation. What the decline of Lake Mead is telling us, having seen the 10 cities most at risk as Lake Mead declines, from Las Vegas and Henderson on the reservoir's doorstep to Phoenix, Tucson, Mesa, and Scottsdale drawing from the Great Canal to Los Angeles, San Diego, and Riverside reaching to the reservoir from the coast and the inland region, and to Yuma, where the river runs low near its end, we can step back and consider what the decline of Lake Mead is telling us. The first lesson is the astonishing reach of a single reservoir. For the worsening of Lake Mead's crisis threatens cities across 3 states and beyond, some drawing directly from the reservoir, others through the Great Canal and the long aqueducts that carry its regulated water across the desert, that so many cities, spread across so vast an area and home to so many millions of people, could be at risk from the decline of one reservoir reveals how deeply the Southwest depends on Lake Mead and how much hangs on its survival. It is a striking thing to realize that a person in a coastal city, a resident of a booming inland suburb, a family in a desert metropolis, and a farmer near the river's end could all depend, in one way or another, on the same great store of water behind the famous dam, their fates quietly linked by the vast plumbing of the river system that few of them ever pause to think about. This shared dependence is the source of both the region's deepest vulnerability and its strongest argument for cooperation, for no single city can save the reservoir alone, and none is truly safe if it fails. The second lesson is that the crisis is getting worse, and this is perhaps the most sobering finding of all, for it means that the risk to these cities is not static, but growing. The forces behind Lake Mead's decline, the warming climate and the enduring demand, are strengthening rather than fading, and as the reservoir falls closer to the critical thresholds below, which its ability to function would be crippled, the danger to the cities that depend on it deepens. Each dry year brings the reservoir closer to the levels at which the generation of power at the dam would cease, and the delivery of water downstream would be threatened, and the approach toward those levels is what fills the managers of the river with dread. The worsening of Lake Mead is a warning that the time for comfortable delay has passed, and that the difficult work of bringing the demand into balance with the shrinking supply must begin in earnest, before the reservoir crosses the thresholds beyond which the consequences would be severe and difficult to reverse. Yet the third lesson is one of hope as much as warning, for the decline of Lake Mead, serious and worsening as it is, can still be slowed and managed. And the cities most at risk are not passive victims awaiting their fate. Many of them have already taken remarkable steps to prepare, banking water underground, conserving fiercely, turning to the sea, and diversifying their supplies, and their efforts show that even in the face of so grave a threat, much can be done to build resilience and to soften the blow. The decline of Lake Mead can be slowed by bringing the demand for the Colorado's water into balance with what the river can provide, through the difficult reform of agriculture, the conservation of water in the cities, the development of new sources, and the cooperative management of the reservoir so as to keep it from falling to the critical levels. What happens to Lake Mead and to the 10 cities most at risk will depend on the choices made in the years ahead, on whether the states and the users can come together to share the shrinking water and to keep the great reservoir from failing, and on whether the cities can continue to build the resilience that would help them endure. Lake Mead is getting worse, and the 10 cities that depend on it are watching anxiously, but the story is not yet written, and the same determination that built this great reservoir and the civilization it sustains can yet be turned to the task of saving them both. There is a final thought worth holding on to as we consider the decline of Lake Mead and the cities it threatens, and it is that the pale rings on the rock around the reservoir, marking how far the water has fallen, are a warning written plainly upon the land for anyone to see. Unlike the invisible depletion of an underground aquifer, the fall of Lake Mead is visible, dramatic, and undeniable. A slow-motion emergency unfolding in plain sight, its progress measured on the canyon walls for all to witness. This visibility is, in a way, a gift, for it makes the crisis impossible to ignore and gives the region a constant, unmistakable reminder of the stakes. The question is whether that reminder will be heeded, whether the sight of the retreating waters will spur the difficult action needed to slow the decline, or whether it will be watched with resignation as the reservoir falls further. The 10 cities most at risk have every reason to act, and many of them already are, but the fate of Lake Mead depends on more than the efforts of any single city, requiring the cooperation of all the states and users who share the great river. The reservoir's fate hangs in the balance, and with it, the water security of 10 cities and the tens of millions of people who depend on the great store